Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from. This is Genesis to Exodus from Family to Nation. It's been a pleasure learning with you over this fall's mon. This is the last session in this series for now. We've been learning with Rabbi Silber, the Dean of Dresha, for these past about 8 or 9 weeks. And we will conclude today's class finally at the book of Exodus / Shemot. One bit of housekeeping is as people are coming in, I see you in the attendees. I'm going to be sending invitations to panelists. If you would like to accept this invitation, you will be able to turn on your screen, show yourself, unmute yourself, ask questions directly. I strongly recommend it, especially if you turn on your camera. That makes for a nice learning environment. But all I ask is if you accept this, to please keep yourself muted unless not directly speaking. We can and will hear everything going on around you. If you have questions during class, whether on Zoom or on Facebook Live, do not hesitate to ask them in chat. I will bring them to Rabbi Silber's attention. If you are in Zoom and you are an attendee, if you ask me in chat or unmute or use the raise your hand function, I am happy to unmute you and you can ask yourself. Sources for today's class come from the end of the first chapter and the second chapter of Shemot. I will be sharing those on screen from Sefaria, but please feel welcome to follow along in your Tanakh of choice. With that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're up to we virtually completed the first chapter of Sefer Shemot. That is Israel came down to Egypt as a family, Ishu Beit Bo, Bayit, and they are multiplying very greatly. Paru vayishutzu vayirbu vayatzmu, and there are many. One might say the beginnings of a nation, the possibility of becoming a nation, because of the many more souls that have been born in Egypt. And Paro, a new Paro, decides that they are a danger or a threat, and he takes measures to both to limit their growth and ultimately to kill many of them. He first tries with the midwives to sort of secretly have them killed, at least the boys, but that doesn't work because the midwives refuse to listen. And then at the very end of chapter 1, the last verse of chapter 1, Vayitzav Paro l'chol amo lemor, Rabbein hayilod hayora tashlichu, l'chol habat techayun. So Pharaoh commanded his people, saying, all the boys that are born, throw them into the river, to the Nile, l'chol habat techayun, but the girls, techayun, here the translation is let every girl live, but the Ramban pointed out that techayun doesn't mean let them live. Tichyun would be let them live. Techayun, if one reads it that way, it means keep them alive. And the point of the Ramban is that what Paro was saying, in effect, is what Paro said back in chapter 12 of Breshit, namely what Avram said to Sarah, say you're my sister, because if they think I'm your husband, they will kill me and they will keep you alive. That is to say, they will take you. What he's saying to her is not just for my own sake, but actually for your sake as well, because they'll imprison you, they'll capture you, and which is what happens. They capture her, and Paro captures her, and she's with Paro, and she'll never get out. But God intervenes, and God plagues Paro, Vayinagash and Paro, and Rabban pointed out. And that story of going down to Egypt in a famine and being persecuted and being abused, and God intervening through the plagues, is exactly the story of the book of Exodus. So that the story in chapter 12 of Breshit is a kind of preamble to the story of Exodus, what the Ramban calls Ma'aseh Avot Siman Gebanim. And this repeats throughout history, particularly the story of the matriarchs. Ma'aseh Avot Siman Gebanim. So that's what we have over here at the end of chapter 1. We have the classical story of Mitzrayim that we encountered back towards the beginning of Breshit. Now it repeats again with this Paro. That's where we left off. And let's begin now with the second chapter of Shemot. So the first pasuk is Vayelach ish mi beit Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. That's a very interesting verse. So a man here they say a certain man, a man, a member of the house of Levi, Beit Levi, took into his household, let's say he married a daughter of Levi. So we remember the very first verse of Sefer Shemot, the very first verse of this book was Eila Shemot, Bnei Yisrael Mitzrayim, Eish Yaakov, Ishu Beito Bo, each one came with his house. We came down to Egypt, 12 sons of Yaakov, but each one came Ishu Beito, with their bayit, with their household. And here in the very first verse of this second chapter, we talk about Beit Levi, the house of Levi. So the house of Levi is, the Torah described the Levi's family still as Beit Levi, which is the very first verse of the book. He took a daughter of Levi, so a certain person. In other words, the Torah does not tell us the name of this person, nor does it tell us the name of the woman that he marries. And here it's very interesting because actually we know who this man is, because the story of chapter 2 is about the birth of Moshe. And the Torah makes a point, actually, more than a point, about Moshe's genealogy, because in chapter 6 of Sefer Shemot, we have a very strange chapter, which is a genealogy, but not of all the tribes. The tribe of Reuven, the tribe of Shimon, and the tribe of Levi. And when you get to the tribe of Levi, the Torah stops. It doesn't tell us the genealogies of any other tribe. And it stops with the birth of Moshe and the birth of Aaron. As if to say, all of the genealogies, the point of the genealogies in this book is to tell us the history, the background, the yichus, as it were, of Moshe and his brother Aaron. And we know who the father is. It's explicit. Not only do we know who the father is, we don't even know who the mother is. So what do you mean a man went from the house of Levi and took a daughter of Levi? The Torah could have said, Vayelech Amram bibeit Levi, vayikach et Yochevet bat Levi. But the Torah does not say that. And therefore we are struck by that. And what do you make of it is the question. And I think the first thing that comes into our mind, I presume, is the following. That in the previous chapter, the book begins with a bunch of names. The book is called Eila Shemot. These are the names. And it gives us the name of Yaakov and the name of all of Yaakov's sons. It actually repeats what it had said earlier in chapter 46 of the previous book of Bereshit. We came down with a house, and we came down with a name. And the point is, when you come to chapter 2, yes, there is still the house of Levi, but you have to wonder, is there any other house besides Beit Levi? And there are no names. It's a chapter which is marked by the absence of names. And that's even more striking, given the fact that in chapter 1, towards the end of the chapter, we have the story of these midwives. And the Torah tells us, these miyaldot or ivriot, either Hebrew midwives or women who birth the Hebrews. And either way, the Torah tells us that when Paro speaks to these two women, Shem Hoachat Shifra v'Shem Hasheni Pua. One is named Shifra and one is named Pua. In other words, they have names. And they refuse to listen to Paro's commands because they're God-fearing, as we talked about that last week. God-fearing means you have your own set of values. You don't necessarily follow what the king tells you to do. And the next to last verse of chapter 1 is Elohim batim. Because since the women were God-fearing, God rewarded them batim, and God made for them houses. It's the end of chapter 1. So it's very striking. Batim, what does that mean? God made houses for them. What does it mean? Bought them condominiums? What does that mean? The Medrash says, Batim, because the Medrash identified the women, Shifra and Pua, with Yocheved and Miriam, which of course is not the pshat, but it doesn't matter. There's identification here. And Batim, so the Medrash says, Batim means dynasties. And in the Jewish tradition, there are two dynasties. There's the priesthood, which is passed down from generation to generation, say father to son, and the king, which is dynastic. So Vayas Lehem Batim, for them, Rashi cites the Medrash, of course, Vayas Batim, Bate Kahuna, or Bate Malchut. Then the question, how do you get Bate Kahuna and Bate Malchut from Shifra and Pua? I mean, Kahuna you get because it's House of Levi. But how do you get kingship out of it? After all, the king is from the tribe of Judah, not from the tribe of Levi. So that's the Medrash, whatever. Not our problem now. But my point is something else, that these God-fearing women, they have names and they have houses. And that's how we started out. But the point is that presumably what's happening over the course of chapter 1 is we are losing our names. That's the point of chapter 2. And for the most part, as we'll see, we're losing a sense of household. Another question is, why did that happen? Why did we lose the name? And why did we lose the bayit? And I think we can suggest several different reasons why perhaps we lost both the name and the bayit. And one of them could be simply, I mentioned last week, you lose a sense of identity when there's a great multiplication. It's not. It came down as a family. You know the members of the family for the most part, even big families. You sort of know everybody in the family. But when you become a big nation, big institution, that's the danger, that you lose a sense of the individual. So that's one possibility. The possibilities do not conflict with each other. The second possibility is that because of the persecution, because chapter 1 is about Paro telling his people, we have to oppress them. Inui, Inui and Abdut, they appear right away, middle of the chapter 1, as we saw. And the last verse of chapter 1 is the permission or the instruction to, when you find a little Jewish boy, to kill the boy, to throw him into the river. So, and to kidnap the women on top of it. So that can lead to a breakdown of your own society. When you become enslaved, clearly, that's, slaves can't form a real community. So the persecution can be another reason that we lose the name and we lose the bayit. And then there's another possibility, which is a very interesting one, which sounds contradictory to the second possibility. I'm wondering if it's actually contradictory. Strangely enough, it may not be contradictory, and that is that the Jews in Egypt lose a sense of identity. It's not just beginning now with the Pharaoh who emerges, the new Pharaoh, but actually over time, the Jews have been in Egypt for a long time. And as the Torah said about the brothers, they became their permanent place, as it were. They make no attempt to leave the land. There's no attempt to leave. Maybe they can't leave, or maybe they don't want to leave. So there's another possibility, which is that the Jews have bought into Egyptian culture. They become assimilated, and they've lost their sense of identity. And that's an interesting question, to what degree the Jews in Egypt are actually Egyptians. To what degree are they accepting the Egyptian culture, maybe the Egyptian deities? That's a very interesting question. In the book of Shemot, it's not all that clear that the Jews are assimilated into the culture of Egypt, but in other books, such as Yechezkel, it makes the point that the Jews in Egypt have become Egyptians. There is, of course, a famous medrash about the Jews in Egypt, that they didn't change. To what degree were they separate? To what degree were they had their own identity? It was the way they dressed, it was the language they spoke. Again, those are symbols of one's own identity. But that medrash doesn't speak about their religious identification necessarily, more of a cultural and social identification. And we might say more broadly that to some extent, as much as the Jews may want to assimilate, the Egyptians don't want to accept them. That was one of the features of the Yosef narrative. Yosef, on a moral plane, does not buy in fully to Mitzrayim, clearly. And that's the story of Mrs. Potiphar. But it's also true that the Egyptians see the Jews, and maybe every stranger, as the Ivri, as the one from the other side. So these are three separate possibilities. I think they all can be true, actually. You might ask, how can you be both persecuted and assimilated at the same time? But unfortunately, it is possible. that even people that are persecuted still want to want to be favored by the one who persecutes them. That is the sad, I think, a sad fact of life, that often we do encounter that the abused person wants the favor of the abuser. Actually, we'll see that later when we resume these sessions, that in Mitzrayim it's certainly the case that when Paro persecutes them, the one that people go to help them is actually Paro. It's pathetic, but that's the way it's described in Sefer Shemot. In any event, those are three different possibilities as to why we have lost a sense of identity. So the bayit is one point, and we'll see it later on in our studies that Moshe's task, which he accepts, will be to reconstitute the idea of bayit. It's very central. Before we leave Egypt, we have to establish a sense of our own community, our own households. That's very important. But in any event, coming back to the verse that we've started with, namely verse number 1, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. So the unnamed Levite, he took a daughter, a Levite. There's the one thing we know about in this chapter about the identity is Levi. That we know. One might say maybe the Levium kept their identity for whatever reason, but I actually believe there's another reason that the Torah singles out, that the person who goes and takes a wife, that he's a Levi who marries a woman from the tribe from Levi. A different reason that we'll come to later on. Okay, before I stop and take some comments or questions, just another point of interest over here in verse number 1. And that is that there's a famous medrash. Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, a man went from the house of Levi, vayikach et bat Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. So the medrash claims that vayikach et bat Levi, he took the advice of a bat Levi, will be a daughter of Levi, but the medrash says he took advice of his own daughter. That's the famous medrash. A man went from the house of Levi, and he took vayikach, not that he took in marriage, but he took the advice, he accepted the advice of bat Levi, not a member of a female member of the house of Levi, but rather his own Levite daughter. And what is driving the medrash to say that, and it's very hard to know generally what drives these midrashim, because the midrashim, I believe, were not just a particular explanation, but a whole big discussion about various chapters of the Torah. They originate with something, but what bothers the medrash, among other things, is very simply this. The story of chapter 2 is about the birth of Moshe. A Levi man went, and he married a Levite woman, and they have this child, turns out to be Moshe, and the story is about Moshe's birth. The problem that bothers the medrash is very simply what happened. Moshe is the youngest of three. So what did he married and they had Moshe? What happened to Aaron and to Miriam, his older brother and older sister? So therefore, the medrash says, no, a man, he was already married once before. They had two children. And then when Pharaoh issues a decree that all the boys should be thrown into the river, he separates from his wife. And according to the medrash, not in the text, but the medrash says that his daughter, who's Miriam, spoke to her parents, maybe only to her father, and said, "What are you doing over here? I know you don't want to stay married. You don't want to have any more children, because," she says, "you might have a boy, and the boy be thrown into the river." But then she says, but maybe you'll have a girl who won't be thrown into the river. Okay, she's not assuming that the girl's going to be kidnapped, I presume. But the point is, it's a very interesting medrash. So then he takes the advice of his daughter. He then reunites with his wife, Yocheved, and they have this child. That's the medrash. But when you read these midrashim, which are very complex, actually, because it's not just about this verse, it's a whole description, for example, of this woman, of his daughter Miriam, presents her as a kind of, I would say, feminist, for want of a better word. Maybe you have a girl, you won't have a boy. There may be 50-50 chance. But the point is, she once again, what kind of daughter says this to her parents? In other words, there's a certain amount of chutzpah over here. There's a certain advocacy for the role of the women. And the Medrash sees this as reflecting the character of Miriam that emerges from other stories of the Torah, in particular, the story in the book of Bamidbar, in which she criticizes Moshe. So it's part of this whole midrash or midrashic reflection on the character of Miriam, at least as emerges from the written text that we have. So that's medrash. And it's an interesting medrash, because the medrash in Bamidbar, remember the medrash in Sefer Bamidbar, the medrash says that she criticized Moshe. Remember what she says there in Bamidbar, in chapter 11 of Bamidbar, chapter 12 of Bamidbar, she criticizes Moshe, who had married a Cushite woman. He had married a Cushite woman. And she said, is he the only prophet? We're also prophets. So there the Medrash is bothered by many questions. One is, what is the relationship between marrying a Cushite woman and saying, is he the only prophet? Well, what do you have to do with the other? So the Medrash, the Midrashic response, which parallels what they say over here, is, who's this Cushite woman that he married? So the Medrash claims that the Cushite is actually Tzipporah, Moshe's wife, and that Moshe had separated from Tzipporah. Yes, I know Tzipporah is not a Cushite. That's a question, but it doesn't matter. And Moshe had separated from Tzipporah. Tell the stories. Miriam hears women saying to Tzipporah, what a lucky woman you are, married to Moshe Rabbeinu. She says, lucky, are you kidding? Haven't seen this guy in months. He's off with God all the time. He doesn't spend any time with me. So Miriam hears this, that he's separated from Tzipporah, and she critiques Moshe. She says, he's so holy, he's separated because he's a prophet. I'm also a prophet. Aaron's also a prophet, and we're living with our spouses. What makes him different? That's the way the Medrash interprets it. But the point is that the critique of Miriam over there, among other things, is the separation of Moshe from his wife, which is what the Medrash reads into verse number 1 of our chapter 2. He took the advice of his daughter Miriam, who told her father to get back together with her mother, have more children. Don't separate because of the decree of Pharaoh. And therefore, and the point is, the decree of Pharaoh was after Miriam and Aaron were born. So therefore, the story starts with, that's the Midrashic reading. It's quite a brilliant reading. Has all kinds of other pieces to it as well. But that's the Medrash. In any event, our point here is, to repeat, a man went from the house of Levi. He took a woman, a daughter of Levi, no names. In the book which starts, these are the names. So this is, and we'll see this is true of the whole chapter. There are no names. Now, let me stop here for a moment. Are there any comments or questions on what we have done so far?
I was thinking on the point of assimilating and being accepted. We just read on Shabbos that they couldn't even eat together. That
Right.
even if Bnei Israel were trying, it was a doomed effort. They were
right. I don't know if they were trying over there, but the point is, they come down to Egypt, and yes, it's not just that the Egyptians won't eat with Joseph's brothers; they won't eat with Joseph either. That's the point.
Right.
They eat separately. There's 3 separate tables. There's Joseph, there's the Egyptians, and the brothers. And the brothers don't eat with Joseph because he's the viceroy of Egypt, and they're just the people coming for food. So for their perspective, Joseph is the Egyptian viceroy. So they eat separately. But for the Egyptians, who won't eat with them, plural, it says because the Egyptians won't eat with the Hebrews, from their perspective, Joseph is the Ivri. It sums up Joseph perfectly. When he's with his brothers, he's the Egyptian. And he's with the Egyptians, he's a Jew. So who was he? But yes, that is true. And that's an important point. And actually, there's something else in the parsha that we read. Actually, it's in the previous week's parsha in Vayeshev, but that's the story of Mrs. Potiphar. And Mrs. Potiphar says to the people of the household, look, my husband brought this guy to mock us. So she plays off the the dislike or hatred of the stranger. She says it's not about me, it's about us. That's what she says. But Sachik Banu. So yes, the point is, even if Joseph wanted to assimilate, and he has his red line, which is Mrs. Potiphar, but even if he does want to assimilate, the Egyptians will never accept the outsider fully, because they're always the Ivri. That is certainly the case. Yeah.
Rabbi?
That's yeah.
Rabbi, hi, it's Sandra. On the subject of the names, is it significant that the the entire book begins with the Eile in the singular, and the names are clearly plural? Have you drawn any conclusion, or has it ever come up? The Eile Shemot Bnei Yisrael Asher Yardu Mitzrayim. I mean, that's singular, and it's clear that we're looking at plurality.
No, Eli would translate these are the names. I don't think that's singular. Why is it singular?
But you don't think the Eile, you might say, if it were translated into English our way, it would be, and here's the list, and the list is a singular item. Okay, I just was wondering why the Eile Shemot, when I would have thought it would be the Elu Shemot.
Oh, yeah, actually, good question. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought about that. It's an interesting question. I just want to look back at chapter 46 and see what it says over there, when it has the name over there. Oh, it's the same. The Eile Shemot Bnei Yisrael Haboim Mitzrayim. It's identical. In chapter 46, verse number 8. Yeah. They translate, these are the names. Yeah, that's a good question. Why Eile as opposed to Elu? Good question. I don't know. I have to think about that. But in any event,
Thank you.
We came down with names, and now this is the chapter of no names. A man went from the house of Levi, took a daughter of Levi. Yeah, let's continue now with the second verse.
David?
Yes.
I also, when I read that thing that they wouldn't eat with him,
Yeah.
it reminded me of what I think is the saddest pasuk in the Sefer of Vayeshru Lechol Lechem, the brothers. And here again we have Lechem, and here they're trying to eat together and they still can't. And there they did it after, hearing him scream and everything. It just the juxtaposition of those two, or not just
right. No, you're right. It's an interesting thought there that in the case of in the case over there, it's not just they're eating lechem separately. In the case over there, he has no lechem and he doesn't even have water. They're sitting down to a sumptuous meal,
and
the
he's
guy
crying
screaming nearby, pleading with them to get him out of there. Doesn't have bread or water. In fact, he'll obviously at some point die in the pit, which is their intention, to kill him at that point. They intend him to die. So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't speak well for them, but it's an interesting, it fits in more broadly with all the things that are happening in Mitzrayim are remind us of the Yosef story, the sale of Joseph, or the throwing him into the pit and all that. That is, that's for sure, that's certainly true. And certainly one can read the story to some extent as Yosef wanting to pay them back for what they did, whatever his motivation may be. I mean, at the end of the day, the truth of the matter is that the brothers' experience causes them, one might say, or that pushes them towards a kind of tshuva. That is true. The question is, was that Joseph's intention or not? That's a separate. It's one question about his motivation, and there's the other question about story about them being tested. They're certainly being tested. The question is, was that his primary motivation, or that something that happens in the course of the story, regardless of his motivation? But yes, it's a good point. But tying those two lechems together is good. Okay, so let's continue now. Vataro Isha Vateled Ben, Vatero Toki Tovu, Vatis Beneu Shosha Yirachim. Obviously, a very strange verse. So they're married, and the woman gives birth. She has a son, which is important because all this boy is going to be thrown into the river. When she saw that he was Tov, she hid him for 3 months. So here, of course, the word they translate Tov as beautiful. The word Tov does not mean beautiful. Tovat Mareh means beautiful. Tov means good. And of course, the Ramban's question is an obvious question. What do you mean she saw he was beautiful and she hid him for 3 months? First of all, one mother thinks the child is not beautiful. Let's start with that. And second of all, beautiful or not, that's hardly should be the basis of whether or not you try to save his life. So the Ramban is bothered by this Winky Tofu. So the Ramban has his answer, of course, famously. The Ramban makes the claim that Tov does not mean good. Tov for the Ramban means viable. Ki Tovu, the Ramban says this, the beginning of the Torah, when it says that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. Vayaro God, Vayom Elohim Yehi-or, Vayhi-or. Vayaro Elohim es-ha'or ki tov. So the Ramban asked the question, what do you mean that God saw the light was good? God didn't know before God created the light was going to be good? I mean, you hire an architect to build you a house. It looks great on paper. Then it's all completed. And you realize there were 1,000 problems. You thought it was going to be beautiful. It's a bunch of problems. Sometimes that happens. So you expect something and doesn't turn out the way you expected it. The Ramban says that can't be true of God. The omniscient God's going to know exactly what it looks like before it's built. Therefore, the Ramban says the word tov doesn't mean it's good. But Yahurim ki tov, the Ramban claims, interesting Ramban, says the following. It says that God created something that exists. The Ramban asks the question, why does it continue to exist? Why doesn't it simply cease to exist? We don't think in those terms today. We think quite the other way around. We think if something exists, it continues to exist. Unless there's some reason it doesn't exist. An object in motion remains in motion. Unless something slows it up, it's going to be forever in motion. But the Greeks, Aristotle, didn't think that way. Aristotle has different causes. And for Aristotle, you have to explain, if you shoot an arrow, okay, why does it continue to go? That's one of Aristotle's the four causes. So the Ramban's in that same headspace, as it were. The Ramban says that kitov means it's viable. God wishes that it continue to exist. And that's how he explains this verse as well, that the woman gave birth, Vatero Toki Tovu, and she saw this is a child that could actually live. It's a viable child. Since it can live, she tries to make sure that in fact it does live. In any event, the Ramban, I mentioned the Ramban here. Ramban's always interesting, but of course the Ramban is hinting at something else, which Rashi makes explicit. Because Rashi is bothered by the same problem. What do you mean she saw the child was good? Vatero Toki Tovu, and Rashi makes the comment, Nitmalei habayit ora. When the child was born, the house was filled with light. And that's a medrash that Rashi quotes. That's all Rashi says. But I don't know what Rashi's thinking, but the medrash Rashi quotes is obvious. That among other things, the Torah here in chapter 2 of Shemot is connecting us to the beginning of the Torah. The first created thing was the light. Vayarohim et ha'or ki tov. When Moshe is born, the house was filled with light. So what Rashi is getting at is the following. In chapter 1, it talked about the children of Israel growing. Paru vayishritu vayirbu vayatzmu. That's all language taken from chapter 1 of the Torah. That's creation language. And the Medrash picks up on this and says, Moshe being born, Vatero Toki Tovu, she saw that Kitov, in other words, what she's seeing over here is more than just a beautiful child. What she's seeing, or what the Torah is telling us, perhaps, even if she doesn't see it, is that this child is going to be at the center of a new creation. The new creation is going to be the people of Israel, and that this book, Sefer Shemot, is also a book about creation. It's creation of the nation. It's parallel to the creation in the first book in Genesis, and this is the creation of the nation. What's central to the creation of the nation is someone's got to emerge as a kind of leader to help God carry out God's plan. That's going to be this boy who is Tov, who's the first created thing. By the way, just in passing, parenthetically, I don't want to get into this, nor do I consider myself terribly knowledgeable about this. But the point is that there's a famous medrash, and of course the Kabbalistic writings about this as well, that God saw the light was good, says the medrash and the Kabbalistic writings, that primordial light, that first light, was actually hidden away. They call the Or Hagonus, the hidden light, which someday will reappear, will reemerge at some time in the future. And I was thinking, I don't know what that's based on, just Kabbalistic thinking, or if it does have some kind of roots in the text. But over here, you have such an idea. The Or HaTzafun. Safun means hidden. Safun and Ganuz, the same meaning, as it were. I was thinking actually that just a few minutes ago, thinking about at the Seder. So at the Seder, we have, of course, we tell the story and we have a meal. And the end of the meal is the Afikomen. And the acrostic that is a table of contents for the Afikomen, Kadesh Rechatz, Karpas Yachetz, Magid Rochza, Motzi Matzah, Mora Korech, Safun Barech. The Afikomen we call Safun. Because the Afikomen is, we don't have a carbon pastel. The Afikomen is, in this poem, a reminder of a future time where things will be better, a future redemption. That's called Safun. That's exactly what you have in this verse, midrashically. Midrashically, and actually, it's close to the pshat. She sees that this child is Tov. This child is Tov, but the redemption is not going to happen right away. So she hides him for 3 months. 3 months she can hide him. Now the next verse says, just to follow up on this thought, when you see it, it's really obvious. She can't keep hiding this child, right? Because people will find out. People will discover him. And if they discover him, they will kill him. So what does she do? Maybe she gave birth prematurely, maybe 3 months later, maybe she gave birth in the 7th month or end of 6 months. In any event, after 3 months, she can no longer hide it. He takes a wicker basket. So what does she do? She's constructing some kind of a plan, presumably, to enable this child to live. We don't yet know what the plan is. As we read further, we'll see what the plan is. I presume it's a plan. She puts him in a basket on the side of the Nile. And here, of course, when you read this child, she can't hide the child anymore. And she puts the child inside a teva. So obviously, the story that we connect to immediately is the story of Noah. Noah is commanded to build a teva and to somehow save himself by being placed in this ark. In this case, it's the mother who constructs a kind of teva, same word, and she's going to she corks the basket, corks it with whatever, chemer and zephet. She places the child inside, the baby inside, and by the side of the ark. And if the first verse, Vatero Toki Tovu, reminds us Vayaro Him Kitov, which was the beginning of the creation of chapter 1, right? The very beginning of creation. And God saw it was Tov. But then we recall in the book of Bereshit, everything is destroyed, and there's a new creation. There's a recreation of the world. And the person that is at the center of the recreation of the world is, of course, Noah. And this new world is recreated, as it were, by Noah building an ark, putting himself and his family inside the ark and taking representational animals. And this new world will then, after the ark will find a resting place, this new world will be created. So here, of course, the Chumash, in these very couple of first few verses of chapter 2, recalls for the reader, because remember, we're assuming the reader has read the first book. Second book begins V'elu Shemot. It's a continuation. It's not a new book. It's new, yes, but it's also a continuation with the Vav. So we presume the reader has read very well the creation narratives of Genesis. And now we are connecting Moshe to Noah. Now, in point of fact, I want to make one more point about this, and I'll stop and take any comments or questions. It just so happens that the Moshe and Noah connection is one that the book of Exodus is going to remind us once again about this connection between the two of them. In one of the most important chapters of this book, a turning point in the book, the Chumash will recall Noah and will contrast Moshe with Noah. In fact, we're going to read that parsha this Friday. This coming Friday, very interesting, is actually the 10th day of Tevet, Silber Tevet. It's one of the fast days. Over the past several years in Israel in particular, it's a day in which we recall the Shoah, the Holocaust. And it's the only fast day we have that can fall on Friday. And on the fast days, we have a Torah reading, which begins with the words, Vayichal Moshe et bnei Hashem Elokav. Moshe entreated God, which is taken from chapter 32 of our book, Shemot chapter 32. And in that chapter, Moshe prays for the people after the golden calf. God is very angry. God threatens to destroy all the people. And God says to Moshe, listen, I've had enough with these people. Let me destroy them, and I'll make a new nation out of you. And then that's the background to the parsha. And the reading starts with Vayichal Moshe Pnei Hashem Elokav, but Moshe entreated God. Why are you so angry at your people? You took them out of Egypt. What will the world say, etc., etc. So the point is that the offer Moshe is made in chapter 32 of Exodus is exactly what God says to Noah in chapter 6 of Genesis. Namely, the world is no good, so forget them, and I'm going to let's start a different world, and I'll start it with you because you're okay. You're a tzaddik, you're a tamim, you walk in my path. So let's create the world out of you. And Noah says, thank you very much. And Noah goes off and builds his ark. But in the case of Moshe in chapter 32, God makes the identical offer to Moshe in chapter 32. And the parsha, what we read on fast days, is Moshe's refusal to accept God's offer. My point is that the Moshe and Noah link, and maybe there are more connections, who knows, as we go through the book, but this one is obvious, that Moshe is represented here as a Noah character. He's going to be saved from the destruction. Pharaoh wants to kill all the boys, and Moshe will be saved by being inside a teva. Now, in the case of Moshe's teva, he's a little baby, a newborn, so he's going to need some help. Someone's got his mother and his sister are going to have to make that possible. But of course, the very beginning of chapter 2 just reinforces what we said last week. Namely, this is a creation book. It begins with creation, it ends with the Mishkan, which is based on the two creation narratives. And the main hero is somebody who's identified both with the initial creation of the world, Kitov, and then with Noah. And we'll see later on throughout our study the relationship between these Noah and Moshe as well.
Rabbi,
yes.
I was going to say the word Yeor, like it kind of gave light and life to him. So there's the Aleph Vav Resh in that word itself, the word Yeor. And
that is a very interesting point, actually. I myself have pointed out that the word Yeor and Or, by the way, I'm pretty sure the Ramban says this. It's in the Ramban. The Ramban points out that Yeor and Or are related terms because, and what is a support for the Ramban and a support for you is that the word Nahar, another word for rivers is the word Nahar. But of course, in Aramaic, which is closely aligned with the Hebrew, Nahora imei shrei. Nahora means light. So Nahora, right? Nihiru anpin, Nahora is light. So therefore, the connection between the waters and the light is actually very interesting. Exactly what that connection is a very good question. But in any event,
Ramban says that at the beginning of Miketz, on the first pasuk, right at the beginning.
Does. I remember he says it. I remember where it is, but he does say it. I'm not sure he mentions Nahar, but I mentioned that. But I think
He does.
he mentions Nahar as well. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, Shaky, I didn't remember that, but no, for sure. And remember that Nahar, by the way, together with Yam, together with Tahom, these are all gods of the ancient Near East. And there is something, by the way, and this is certainly true, and many have pointed this out, that there are all kinds of allusions. I said before, it's unclear what degree the Jews in Egypt have assimilated into Egyptian culture. We don't know. It's very hard to know. I mean, Joseph is married to the daughter of a high Egyptian priest. Let's not forget that. Yes, he maintains his own Jewishness. That's Joseph. But it's not clear that the people maintain it. And we will see that there are allusions. This is not my discovery, but there are allusions to the gods of Egypt in the course of the story of the Exodus. One of the chief gods of the Egyptians, this I remember my mother telling me this when I was a little kid, is a god named Ra. Ra is the sun god, who's a very central god in Egypt. And there are all kinds of interesting plays on language with the word Ra, Reish Ayin, which means evil. And of course, the ninth plague is the last penultimate plague, is that of Choshech, the darkness. So there is something to be said. One can read the 10 plagues as not just an attack on Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but an attack on the Egyptian gods. And in fact, God said that explicitly. And I will do battle against the gods of Egypt. So certainly there's a war taking place between God, Hashem, and between the gods of Egypt. And maybe Pharaoh may think he himself is a god as well. So against Pharaoh and the god, there is that going on. Now, where the Jews stand in all this, that's a very interesting question. But it wouldn't surprise us, actually, if Yaor actually is, which means light as well, it takes us back to the very beginning of time, and it's a kind of allusion to we know that the main gods in the ancient Near Eastern descriptions of creation are gods of the deep waters. Tiamat, Tahom is a good example, and Yam is another one, and Nahar is another one. These are all gods of the deep waters, which is how the Torah begins. So there's something to be said for that, and I think it's an interesting point. And the broader point is very interesting. To what degree, in reading the Exodus narrative, we detect references to the Egyptian culture, that is, to the gods of Egypt. I think there's a lot to be said about that. In any event, coming back to our couple of verses over here, so we have Moshe as being
Rabbi,
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Is what you just said about connecting Moshe and Noah, that Moshe prayed for Bnei Israel, is that where the message comes from, that everybody criticizes Noah that he didn't pray for the world? Is it based on this?
It's hard to know what it's based on. I think it's based more on probably on the parallel to Abraham, because Abraham does pray, prays for Sodom, etc. But yes, I think it's hard to know what it's based on, because these things are all. The Medrash was at one point probably long compilations. I think what I said is pretty obvious, actually, and I'm sure other people say it as well. I want to add one thing to which is an important point, and I made this point several times. When I say there's a critique of Noah. When you read the story of Moshe, you read a critique of Noah. Maybe when you read Abraham praying, there's a critique of Noah. But when you read the story of Noah, there is no critique of Noah. Not at all. There's not the slightest intimation that Noah failed by not praying for the world. Not at all. The Chumash emphasized several times, Vayas Noach kasher tzivah oto Elohim, kasher tzivah Hashem. And God said to Noah straight out, you're the only good guy in the world. People, they're all wicked, and I've decided to save you and to destroy them. That's what God says. It's not the same as Abraham, for example, when God says to Abraham, I'm going to tell you what I plan to do. You care deeply about justice. So Abraham says to God, is this just? God invited Abraham, and God invited Moshe to pray also. Leave me alone, I'll do it. So Moshe understands, leave me alone, I'll do it, means don't leave me alone. So in those cases, there are invitations to pray. In the case of Noah, there was no invitation. So I don't actually believe that the Chumash in the initial setting criticizes Noah at all. But it is true that you can read through the later stories of Abraham and Noah and Moshe. There, you can read a critique, and the Midrashim are picking up on that. I just wanted to emphasize that it's more complicated, because in the initial reading, I defy anybody to show me where there's a slightest critique of Noach. Quite the opposite. He does what God tells him to do. God says do X, he does X, and God's not suggesting maybe there's a way out. No, when God says do X and God doesn't suggest there's a way out, then you do what God tells you to do. Same thing is true of the Akedah.
Right.
Abraham, God's not asking him to pray. In the case of Sodom, God requests a prayer. In the case of the Akedah, it's clear. This is a test. This is what they want you to do. Fine. Avram doesn't complain. He accepts what God tells him. Yes. Who else? Someone else wanted to say something there.
Yes.
Laszlo?
The irony of Pharaoh's command that you throw the children into the river, and here the river is the way in which a child is saved.
Yes, of course. Right. Throw the boys in. Oh, there's another irony too. Just throw the boys in, but the girls were going to take, suggesting that the girls actually have no power whatsoever. But of course, the entire story of Moshe's birth and salvation depends upon the women. And not only the women in general, but even his own daughter. That is it's an irony as well. He seems to be suggesting, kill the boys, they're dangerous. The girls will take for ourselves. But of course, in the story, it's both Shifra and Pua in chapter 1. It's the mother and the sister in chapter 2. And above all, it's his own daughter, as we'll see, who has a different moral compass than her father. And we'll see that. Let's just continue now. Verse number 4, fine. Very important verse. I know they're all important. His sister sat from a distance. Again, it doesn't mention the sister's name. In the Chumash, we only know of one sister of Moshe, which is Miriam. Torah does not say Miriam. It said his sister. Or maybe it's a different sister, but it doesn't give a name. Once again, the absence of the absence, and the name Moshe is not given either. This boy is born with no name, and the sister has no name, and she stands meirachok, far away, with to learn or to know what would befall him. So when you read the story of somebody who's standing from a distance, the baby is in trouble, and she stands from a distance. So, of course, the story that this recalls for us, obviously, is the story of Hagar and Yishmael. They're in the desert. They've run out of water. She places the boy under some shrubs. So Hagar sits from a distance, because she just says, I don't want to see what befalls this boy. Boy is her child, and she cries. Here we have, again, someone standing from a distance, but staying from a distance, go back to the previous verse. Standing from, that's it, right there. The daughter stationed herself, was stood from Meirachok. But the Meirachok over here is not because she doesn't want to see what happens. It's quite the opposite. It's to know what does happen. And here, there's a very important small point, which is not small. The Torah did not say to see what would happen, but rather with to know. The Torah uses the word ladat, and the word ladat is probably the key word in the book of Exodus, and I maintain it's also the key word in the book of Genesis. The more you think about it, the more I come across more evidence that this is the case. Seeing over here, that's how the book begins. There was a new Pharaoh emerged, Asher lo yadat Yosef, he doesn't know. So to know over here carries with it more than just intellectually to knowing. For example, we have it in the book of Genesis in chapter 18, when God informs Abraham that God is thinking to destroy Sodom. And God said, can I conceal from Abraham what I plan to do? And then 2 verses later, and why am I telling Abraham this? Ki yidativ, for I know him. It doesn't mean I know him. Ki yidativ, I know about him. Or maybe it means even more than that. I've chosen him, singled him out, because he commands his household to do justice, to dakol mishpat. So Yedativ, Wadat, suggests some kind of, so sometimes it's used sexually. In other words, it's some kind of intimate connection with somebody. So with Deyome Yosela was more than just to see. She's to know what's going to happen in the sense that knowing is related to actually doing. There's a plan over here. This is not just looking and seeing. I think what the Chumash is saying is there's actually a plan, that the mother and the daughter, Yocheved and Miriam in this case, have a plan. They're trying to figure out how to save this child. They're putting him in this teva, hoping that someone will see this little baby in a teva. And when you see something, it's not so simple just to kill someone that you see. Some people are capable of that. But most people, most normal people, are not necessarily doing that so easily. So that's what they are also. And that is, I think, the Medrash that Shifra and Pua are Yocheved and Miriam. The Medrash knows, of course, how unlikely that is. But that's not the point. The point is that the behavior of Shifra and Pua, who together conspire to outwit Pharaoh, they say to Pharaoh, "What we want to do what you commanded, but by the time we get there, these women give birth so quickly, we can't do anything about it." So here too, the Medrash sees a parallel. Shifra and Pua in chapter 1 are parallel to the sister and the mother of chapter 2. And if we assume they're putting it in a particular place, because the Chumash doesn't say, whether they're going to see what's going to happen, and maybe they know that this is a place where Pharaoh's daughter, maybe they know that she, from time to time, will go there to wash up by the side of the Nile, and that's what happens in the next verse. It says, "Vatered bat paro l'chotz al hayar, v'narotera hochot al yad hayar, vateret hateva b'toch hasuf, vatishlachet amata vatikocheh." So Pharaoh's daughter comes down to wash up, to bathe in the Nile with her servants, her maidens walking along the Nile, and she sees this basket. What's the basket doing by the side of the Nile? So she sends out her slave to retrieve it. And let's say one more verse. Next verse. She opens up the basket, and she sees this child, and behold, the child is crying. Nar can mean, as the Ramban says, doesn't always mean a teenager. Nar can sometimes mean even a baby. And she had compassion upon the child. But Thomas, she said, this must be a Hebrew child. It's an abandoned child. Maybe they put it there hoping that it would drown or whatever. And she has pity on the child. And here there's something very interesting about Pharaoh's daughter. And that's the following. We pointed out in the beginning of this chapter that when the child was born, the Chumash had an interesting description of the child who was born. Vatero toki tofu. The child is tov. And now in the previous verse, when Pharaoh's daughter is walking by the side of the Nile, the previous verse number, was it 5? The previous verse. Yes, that verse. So Pharaoh's daughter goes down to bathe. Here we have two words that we have encountered in the book of Bereshit, seeing and taking. The primal sin in the Torah was seeing and taking this forbidden fruit. That the woman saw kitov, that the fruit was good, and she takes it. It's chapter 3 of Genesis. Chapter 6 of Genesis, you have the strange chapter about the Bnei Elohim. Vayru Bnei Elohim et benot ha'adam ki tovot eina. The Bnei Elohim saw that the daughters of the human, the women were tovot, were good, and vayichu, and they took whatever they desired to take. So that's also, in my view, a sinful behavior. Take whatever you want. It's not consensual. And so the first two primal sins are seeing and taking what is told. And then you come to the third kind, which is Egypt. When they go down to Egypt, it says they saw that Sarah was, Avram said, they're going to see that you're told, right? Tovat mere'at. And when they see you, right? When they see you, they're going to, you're a beautiful, doesn't say tov. You're a beautiful woman. Say you're my sister. And it says they saw her and they took her. Now, it doesn't say they saw her, that she was tov and they took her, but it says about Abraham Abraham said, "Say to my sister, that it'd be good for me, tov." And afterwards, Avram hitiv bavura. So I talked about that. That Abraham is a one might say a co-defendant in the crime. He benefits from the crime. The tov goes to him, the money goes to him. But the point is, three stories related to each other, seeing and taking what is tov. And over here, and the third one is about Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the place where they see and take what's tov. But Pharaoh's daughter, actually, the Chumash wants to emphasize that there's Pharaoh, and there's Egypt, and there's Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter is a different kettle of fish over here, because she is seeing and she's taking. But her seeing and taking is not seeing and taking for herself to destroy. Her seeing and taking what is tov, as Moshe has been described in the second verse of the chapter, actually results in Moshe being saved by her. So in point of fact, Pharaoh's daughter was about to adopt this child as her own, together with the other two women, the mother and the true mother, and the sister. Between the three of them, they're going to save this child. And I want to add another point, and I'll stop and take comments or questions. Another point about the verse, the sister stood from a distance to see. And it pointed out that seeing a child from a distance is what we have with Hagar, the Egyptian. And there she sits from a distance, far away, before she says, I don't want to see what happens to the boy. She's very upset. But she abandons the child and she stands far away and cries. And God heard the cry of the boy. So over here, you have, first of all, God hearing that Bat Paro hears the cry of this boy. He's crying, and she has pity on him. But there's another point I wanted to make, which is actually important for this chapter. I'm not sure we'll get there, but the point is, by identifying the sister with Hagar, what the Chumash is saying in effect is, this is a boy who's got three mothers. It's a very modern story. He's got three mothers. He has his own biological mother. He has Pharaoh's daughter who adopts him and is going to name him too, which is an act of parenthood. And not only does he have the Egyptian mother and his own biological mother who's going to nurse him, but he also has a sister who's also a kind of mother. She's a Hagar figure. She's watching about her child from a distance, but in this case, to try to help. She's going to run down and say to Pharaoh's daughter, maybe you want someone to nurse the child. This is part of the plan over here. So here's a guy, basically, kid, who has three different mother figures in his life. And what that reinforces is another point, which will be critical for the story as we continue it at some point in the future, next semester or whatever. Where's his father? He's got three mothers, but where is the father in the story? So that's a very important point, and there will be a surprise as to who the father is. The true father. The true father is not going to be his biological father. He has a biological father, but he has a different father, spiritual father, which is critical to the whole story of Moshe that we'll get to later on. In any event, that's where we stand at this point. Let me just stop for a moment, take comments or questions, and then we'll complete what we'll have today for our beginnings of the birth of Moshe. And does anybody have anything they want to say?
And if you're an attendee, I'm happy to unmute you. Just let me know. Any comments? Anyone? Nothing. It's been quiet in chat, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you.
We can continue. If someone has to speak, they should speak up. Let's take a couple more verses. We still have a few more minutes. Let's continue.
All right.
You left us with a cliffhanger.
Yes.
The spiritual father. Do we have to wait next semester?
I assume it's Yitro.
Yes. Why you to come back? You know what I mean? The spiritual father is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moshe's father is Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Yeah, we will see this. When you see it, it's obvious. But what does that mean exactly? That's not so obvious. There's some very, very interesting points about that. Moshe's relationship to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We call them, we in our prayers, first blessing of the Shemona Esrei, called the Avot. Traditionally, it's the classic blessing is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some people add the Imo too. the Paitanim and the Imahot, but it's called Avot. Because these are our parents, these are our Avot. So the point is, for Moshe, actually, it's very interesting to what extent, or what does that mean that Moshe is the son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? So we'll see. It means two very different things. But that's for the future. Yeah. In any
But
event,
Moshe does not make the cut as one of the Avot. He
Well, of
doesn't
course
make
not.
the cut.
well, the Avot, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov.
Yeah.
He's not one of the Avot. First, he's a later, comes after the Avot. He's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's that teacher. He's the great prophet. But the Avot are Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The Ramban talks about that to some extent too. I mean, very important Ramban, but maybe in the future we'll deal with that. Now the Avot are a different story. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are the Avot. And our prayers, in our Shemona Esrei, when we pray, basically, Moshe is never mentioned in our prayers. Actually, we don't mention him at all. We don't pray to the God of Moshe. We pray to the God of Abraham, Isaac,
Except on Shabbos. On Shabbos he is.
in the Piyutim, Yismach Moshe, because Tzedek, true. But in the standard prayers, it's and it always starts with the Avot. That never changes. Okay, was the. I'm not saying Moshe is not important. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying in terms of the prayers, it's Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And the Gemara says that they actually instituted the prayers. Abraham, the Medrash, Abraham composed Shachrit. Abraham prayed Shachrit. Yitzchak prayed Mincha. Yaakov prays Arvit. So those are the Avot. And Moshe will be their spiritual child. Will be Moshe. Anyway, we'll get to all that later on. It's very interesting later on. So now we have one more verse. Vatomer Achoto, verse number 7. Vatomer Achoto bat Paro. Hailech b'karati lach isha mineket minu evriot. V'teni lach et hayoled. So she says to Pharaoh's daughter, should I call a Hebrew woman to nurse the child? She sees that she's there to see what's going on. So far, the plan is working well. And now the second part of the plan is to bring Moshe back to his natural mother. Maybe you want some woman to nurse the child. It doesn't say the mother, obviously, but some Hebrew woman. And Pharaoh's daughter says, go. So Bat Paro says, fine, go ahead. And she brings him back to and the Alma. Here, the Alma is interesting. The word Alma is related to the word Elem, which means the one who is not identified. In other words, she doesn't say I'm a sister. Her own identity is actually obscured. That's the term Alma over here. It means a young woman, but the word Alma means from Ne'elam, from the hidden one. It's all a plot, and this is the plot. The plot is to bring Moshe back to his natural mother. So Pharaoh's daughter said, "Go ahead, take this child to a Hebrew. I will pay, and I'll pay for it. In other words, it's my child, and this woman is performing a service. From Pharaoh's daughter's perspective, it's her child. Some woman's going to nurse the child, but from the perspective of Miriam and Yocheved, the mother and the daughter, the mother's nursing her own child. So Vatikacho Isha Hayeled Vatnikeu. So she brings back to his natural mother, and woman took the child and nursed it, referring to, I presume, the mother nursing it over here. So here's the point. It's actually right. So it brings it back to a mother. And Vayigdav Hayeled, when the boy grows up, Vatviel lebat Paro vayihi al leben, vatikrosh bo Moshe, vatomer k'mina mayim mishitiyu. After the boy is nursed, it's not clear how old he is exactly, 3, 4, 5, who knows? But at some point, she brings him back to Pharaoh's daughter. Vayihi al leben, and he is the daughter. He's the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter has adopted him as her own child. And not only has she adopted him as her own child, but Tikroshimo Moshe, and she named him Moshe, for she said, Kiminamayim Mishitiyu, I drew him out of the water. So there's a lot to say about this verse. Let me make one or two comments about the verse. We'll have to stop at this point. First of all, one thing that is very striking, I'll make 2 points about this. First of all, that the Torah, so far in these, 9, 10 verses, a child is born. They place the child in an ark. The sister and the mother conspire together. The sister is watching. Pharaoh's daughter comes. She draws him out of the water. The sister runs down. Maybe you need a nursemaid. Yeah, sure, a good idea. Now we didn't pay for it. Boy, he's nursed. It's for quite a while. He grows up, brought back to Pharaoh's daughter, who then names him Moshe, for she says, I drew him out of the water. And here the point is following. He could have been named, usually you name a child upon birth. If you don't name him upon birth, Pharaoh's daughter could have named him when she first drew him out of the water. Then when he's brought back to his natural mother, she could have named him. And then he's brought back to Pharaoh's daughter later, he's grown up. And then she names him, for she said, I drew him out of the water. My point is, it reinforces what I said in the very beginning. This is a book, this is a chapter of no names. You have so many opportunities to name this kid, but he's not named. Nor is the sister named, nor is the mother named, nor is the father named at all. And we know the names of every person. It's not that we don't know the names. We know them in chapter 6, it gives all the names. So the point is, the Chumash is underscoring and emphasizing that there are no names. And I presume since Moshe puts, I drew him out of the water, which is where all the Jewish boys are being thrown into, that Moshe's own experience, as it were, is representational of all the boys that are thrown into the water. But in the case of Moshe, he miraculously is saved. That's point number one. And I want to make one last point before we stop here, which is this, that actually, I'm not going to get involved in the name Moshe, it's a Hebrew, it's an Egyptian, and all that. That's not my point. My point is something else, that actually, she draws him out of the water and she names him Moshe. She says, I drew him out of the water. But in Hebrew, to draw him out of the water, the one who was drawn from the water, you wouldn't name him Moshe. You would name him Moshui. Moshui is the one who was drawn out. But she doesn't name him Moshui. She names him Moshe. Moshe does not mean the one that's drawn out of the water. Moshe means something else. The one who draws out of the water. Moshe is the one who draws out of the water. Here we have a perfect example of what we've seen many times. These names are not just names. Yes, what does Moshe do? What was Moshe's great accomplishments in life? You would say 2 things. First of all, he takes us out of Egypt. He is Moshe us from Egypt. He draws us out of Egypt. And secondly, he brings us to Har Sinai. Of course, he teaches us, he makes us possible to eventually enter the land and all that. That's his story. But the point is, what the Chumash is telling you, pretend you never read it before, A, that he's miraculously saved, but B, his name is Moshe, the one who draws out. So we, the reader, already know at this point that the role that this child will play, having been miraculously saved by his parents and Pharaoh's daughter, by these 3 women, that his role will be to draw out Israel out of the water. The water being representational of the fact is that Pharaoh had said at the end of chapter 1, throw them into the water. And that actually when the plagues come, the first plague is going to be blood, dam, that the waters of the Nile turn to blood. Because at the end of the day, there's plenty of blood in that Nile. That's when the boys are being drowned in the Nile. And Moshe's role is to redeem us and to draw us out. So Moshe is actually the name. Pharaoh's daughter said, I drew him from the water. But we, the reader, understand that the name Moshe has another meaning, which is to draw out. That will be one of his main roles, the one who's be central in taking us out of Egypt. Okay,
Rabbi
so here we
Silber,
are.
Rabbi
Yeah.
Silber, you asked before if we had any questions or connections, and I'm struck at how many times I've read the story, but that's the beauty of your class, of the spate of action verbs, vatishlach, vatikacheha, vatiftach, vatiraehu, vatachmol, and we know we've been trained in Genesis, we have Abraham, we have Rebecca. We've got action verbs fired at us. And it's almost as if the Chumash is saying, pay attention, these are the heroes. This is the heroic behavior. And so even without knowing that she is, in other words, like you say, make believe it's the first time we're looking at it, it strikes me that that would be a very lovely literary neon sign flashing at us and saying, pay attention. These are heroines. Miriam also is doing, she speaks up, she rushes here, she rushes there. It echoes Rebecca rushing hither and yon, which echoes Abraham doing the same. So I'm just wondering if you think that is so, and if it was deliberate and indicates to us the heroines here.
I do. I think that there are three heroines here, all women. And of course, it goes back to what Paro had said. He discounts the role of the women. But what the Gemara says about the Exodus from Egypt, the women are women should drink 4 cups of wine on Pesach and the Seder and all that, fully participating, because they also were in the miracle. And the Rashbam says they were also in the miracle, means they created the miracle. Not just they also were saved. That's some. The Rashbam says it means no, they were instrumental in the deliverance, which is clear. And it's just pointed out that it's sort of the irony of it, that Paro doesn't seem to be concerned about the women, only about the men. It's actually his own daughter, as you point out, who's very active in enabling Moshe to survive. And once he survives, then he's able to make his choice about what he plans to do in his life, which is not so simple for him, but that's how the story will continue, beginning in verse number 11. We'll stop over here at this point. So again, thank you all for participating. I hope to resume, whenever we resume, at the end of January, or whatever it is. There are many other things going on at Drisha. Of course, we have all kinds of programs taking place, and we also have a yeshiva in Israel, which is quite amazing, which is working under very difficult circumstances, helping out there, and also learning. We learned from them even after October 7th. We've been learning solidly, and but also helping out and whatever, trying to do our best before we participate. And we've had to take some very bad losses there too. But part of being in Israel and being involved and doing what's right. Okay. Anyway, thank you all for participating, and looking forward to learning together with you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I would like to highlight 2 upcoming classes.
Thank
3 upcoming
you.
classes. Our Drisha's Winter Week begins next week, December 25th, with 2 classes. One gift of both of these classes are on our Winter Week topic of organ donation. For the first class in the mornings Eastern Time is a gift of life, where we will hear on the more practical aspects of organ donation in a Jewish context, including from Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner, staff of Renewal Transplant Services, and people who have been personally involved in the organ donation process. And in the afternoons, we have the chance to learn with Rabbi Daniel Reifman on the topic of vital organ donation and determination of death. In addition, our Mishnah Yomi series continues with Ketubot in January with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, moving to Tuesday evenings. And for all these classes, you can sign up and find more at 5784.drisha.org/winter. The link has just been posted in the chat. Please consider joining us, especially if you have the chance to take time off at the end of the year. They're very interesting topics with strong teachers. And what's better than a federal holiday for some learning?